We've been talking about a period in Chinese history of great intellectual ferment. This era is sometimes referred to as the Hundred Schools. It takes place during the Warring States period, which is the second half of the long age of fragmentation, the breakdown of the order of the Zhou dynasty. The first half, the spring and autumn period, an era where the number of states grows and proliferates, and the second half from around 500 BC on down, the period where stronger states start to eat up and absorb the weaker states, and the number of overall states begins. Because of this chronic conflict, the Warring States era is an appropriate name for it. It's a period of great instability, of great uncertainty, a time when people were very disturbed, very agitated about what was going on in the world around them. And many people, particularly individuals from the Shi, the elite of professional administrators that we've talked about, asked questions about the order of the world, about how things had gone so wrong and how they could be put right. Last time we talked about two of the most important responses to these questions, the ideas of Confucius and Mencius, the ideas of Laozi and Zhuangzi in the schools of Confucianism and Taoism. While those schools persist and become very, very important and long-lasting in China, there were many other schools of thought, many other individuals who put out ideas during this period, which perhaps didn't become as dominant, didn't become as obviously a characteristic feature of Chinese culture, but contributed in various ways to the development of Chinese political life, of Chinese philosophical discourse. And I want, in this lecture, to look at a couple of the other schools in particular, but first just reflect a little bit about the range of ideas, many of the different schools that were around at this time. Some were very concerned with issues of knowledge and language. We've talked already about the Confucians and the Taoists and how knowledge, our ability to know things, and the way that language affects that and shapes that was important for them. There were other thinkers, other philosophers at this time who really focused on language, on linguistic issues as questions in themselves. They would speculate on, for example, whether when we talked about a white horse, we were talking about something which was essentially white or was essentially horse. Which linguistic term was the primary determinant? Were they describing reality? How were they creating reality? Playing around with words and language and the way that that structures our understanding. This was important for a number of thinkers during this period. Other individuals, particularly a fellow that we call Sunzi, Master Sun, were concerned with military strategy. Obviously, in a period of chronic warfare, ideas about how to wage war, how to organize for war, strategy and combat, these were critical concerns, and rulers were very interested in this. Sunzi was somebody who had no problem finding employment. Confucius was unsuccessful in his efforts to really achieve great influence at various courts. Sunzi, on the other hand, his ideas were very much in demand because he was concerned with the practicalities of waging warfare. And Sunzi's ideas, which relied a lot upon concepts of outwitting your enemy, of defeating your enemy through the cleverness of your stratagems rather than simply the application of superior force, these became characteristic of Chinese strategic thinking in later times as well. Still other thinkers during this period explored cosmological ideas, ideas about metaphysics, ideas about how the unseen world, phenomena in the universe around us that were not immediately perceptible, might affect or shape the experience, the lives that people lived. We'll see some implications of that in later thought. But I want to focus right now on two schools that were quite influential during the Warring States period, but which later, although their texts survive and we know about them, they remain part of intellectual discourse, they cease to be as significant in terms of what people are actually doing, in terms of the practical activity of Chinese in later times. And these are the schools of what's called Moism, after a thinker that we simply call Mozi, Master Mo, and the doctrines of legalism. And legalism will prove to be a practical philosophy, the practical aspects of which remain with us, while the philosophical side tends to be sort of suppressed or put aside. Mozi and the Moists, the people who followed his ideas, are remembered for basically two aspects of their thought and activity. First was that they advocated a doctrine of universal love. They advocated the idea that we should love everyone equally, that you should treat everyone essentially in the way in which you would like to be treated yourself, emphasizing, again, we can see certain commonalities of rhetoric with Confucianism and even Taoism, emphasizing the relationships among people and how those should be properly ordered and regulated. But the emphasis on universal love was, on the part of Mozi, a response, a critical response to some of the ideas of the Confucians. The Confucians emphasized a society which was ordered and regulated in networks of relationships, but within which some relationships were more important than others. And in particular, we've talked about how Confucius was very concerned with the primacy of the family. Indeed, in some texts of Confucius, there are situations where Confucius actually puts the interests of the family above those of the state. There's a very famous anecdote in which Confucius is told about a situation where a young man testifies in court that his father had stolen a sheep. And Confucius sort of shakes his head and says, where I come from, a son does not testify against his father, implying that although it certainly wasn't right to steal a sheep, it was more wrong for the son to testify, to betray, in a sense, his father. So Confucius emphasized the primacy of the family. The Moists, the followers of Mozi, said that sort of division, that sort of priority given to one's immediate family was part of what divided society, was part of what made one royal house want to fight against another royal house, because the royal houses were families, were clans themselves. And so unless you had a doctrine which said that you needed to treat everyone equally, you needed to love everyone equally, you would always have these kinds of divisions and conflicts. The Moists were interesting because not only did they have a philosophical position which said, which advocated these doctrines of universal love, but they also took a very practical response to the conditions of chronic warfare in the Warring States period, and this was that they became experts in defensive warfare. Their thinking was that if you could build up the defenses of smaller and weaker states so that they could effectively resist the aggression of the larger and stronger states, then aggression would cease to be a profitable course of action for the stronger states, and they would stop fighting. They would seek probably still to pursue their interests, but through peaceable means, perhaps through diplomatic or economic or other means. So the Moists trained themselves in the techniques of defensive warfare and then basically went around and offered their services as consultants or advisors to states which were at risk. Now, obviously they did not succeed in completely eliminating the practice of aggressive warfare. The Warring States period continues on down, and it is brought to a close through the aggressive acts of various states. But the idea of using the practical approach of defensive warfare to make aggression unprofitable was quite engaging at the time. There were a lot of people who did apply this, and there were certain instances in which it actually proved to be quite effective. Once the Warring States period came to an end, the ideas of Mozi sort of faded away. They remained, as I say, part of the textual tradition, but in the absence of this kind of chronic conflict, his teachings and his practical activity were no longer quite so relevant. The legalists, on the other hand, had an approach to the questions of social order, the questions of good government, of politics, which was rather different from any of the ones that we've talked about so far. The doctrines of legalism are associated particularly with one state of all the warring states, and that's the state of Qin. Now, we've mentioned the state of Qin earlier because it was the beginning of the rise of the Qin people back in the 8th century, which caused problems for the Zhou court and forced the Zhou to move their royal capital from Shenyang, around the modern city of Xi'an out in Shanxi, to Luoyang, to their secondary capital, moving east into the heartland of China. The Qin people continued to rise in power, to develop their state out there on the sort of northwest periphery of China. And they, as the Warring States era developed and conflict became more endemic, they developed a very effective military state. They developed a system in which the whole society was mobilized and directed towards the objectives of expanding Qin power and taking over and conquering other states. These ideas, the system, the method that the Qin used began to be formulated, articulated in a more self-conscious way back during the 4th century by an individual called Shangyang, who was the chief minister of the state of Qin at that time. And the key to legalism, the key to the practice of legalism and later to its theoretical elaboration is very simple. And it's the idea of rewards and punishments. Rewards and punishments. What Shangyang did was to begin a process that goes on over more than a century and a half of promulgating laws, promulgating codes, regulations, which were meant to give people, first the officials of the Qin state, and then all the people of Qin society, a clear understanding of what their obligations were, what their duties were, what their responsibilities were, what the law was, and of what the consequences of failing to perform their duties, failing to observe their obligations, and failing to obey the law would be. The idea is that if you have clear laws, clear rules that everybody knows, and if everybody understands the consequences of not obeying those laws, then people will behave properly. People will behave according to the will of the ruler. Now, of course, in order for this to be effective, it has to be applied equally to everyone. You can't have some people who are privileged and some people who can escape punishment. It has to be applied to everyone. And this was where the Qin proved to be truly effective because they were very diligent about this. They made sure that if a high government official broke the law, he was punished. If an ordinary farmer broke the law, he was punished. It didn't matter what your status was, what kind of prestige you had, what kind of wealth you had. The law had to be enforced absolutely equally to everyone. And the laws were fairly harsh. Punishments were severe. They often involved the amputation of body parts, death, banishment, things which were meant to be very, very serious deterrents, even simply for relatively minor offenses. So it was a harsh system, but the harshness, at least in theory, the way that the Qin thought about it, the harshness was mitigated by the fact that everybody knew in advance what was going on. You knew that if you stole a sheep, if to go back to the Confucian story, that you would be severely punished for that. So you couldn't say, well, you know, I really needed the wool. There's no mitigating circumstances. The law was very black and white, very cut and dried, and it was a system that proved to be a very effective technique for motivating people. Now, as I say, this began to be developed more consciously, more elaborately by Shangyang, who was chief minister back in the 4th century BCE, In the 3rd century, it gets a sort of philosophical rationale developed by a thinker called Han Fei. Now, Han Fei was a member of this sort of professional elite. He had worked in a number of states before coming to Qin. He's recruited by the leaders of Qin because of his ideas, and he then lives out his life, the rest of his life, as a servant of the Qin kings. And Han Fei gives a philosophical gloss, if you will, to the doctrines of legalism. Han Fei develops a theory of human nature which says that basically people are selfish and greedy, that left to themselves they will pursue their own self-interest. They will always seek to maximize their own personal gain and to minimize their personal pain, their personal discomfort. And so if you use that natural feeling of a desire for good things and an aversion to bad things, then you can motivate people, you can get people to do basically what you want them to do. This is a very modern sounding concept in some ways. It's linked in the Qin state to an idea of rulership, an idea of the nature of the political order, though, that's a little different from what we see in most other circumstances in China, because in Confucianism, in Taoism, in Moism, in many of the other doctrines, there's a sense that there's a natural order, a proper order to the world, that everyone has a place, everyone should be in their place, we should all be performing our various roles. In the Qin state and in the doctrines of legalism, the state exists for the ruler. The ruler is essentially the owner of the state. The state is like his private property, and he can do with it as he pleases. There's none of this sense of reciprocity. There's none of this sense that the ruler has to behave according to certain standards or guidelines. The ruler is absolute. This is a doctrine of absolute power, and it's one in which the state is used then as a mechanism to motivate people not to achieve the greater good, but to do what the ruler wishes. If you have a good ruler, this may be a perfectly reasonable system. But if you have a bad ruler, then obviously you're going to have very unpleasant conditions for people. Now, so long as the Warring States period persisted, so long as Qin was one of a number of states fighting amongst themselves, contending for power, the doctrines of legalism served it very, very well. Indeed, it's not surprising that when we get down to the 3rd century BCE, we see in the final decades of the Warring States period that it is the state of Qin that one by one takes on, defeats, and absorbs its enemies, its final remaining foes. This process reaches its conclusion in the year 221 BCE, when the state of Qin defeats the last remaining other state, which is a state called Chu, a large state in South China centered in the Yangtze River Valley. And the state of Chu is defeated, is conquered, is absorbed by Qin in 221. Now, the leader of Qin at this time is a very famous king. We call him Qin Shi Huangdi. Qin Shi Huangdi. Qin, the state of Qin. Shi is a word that means the beginning or the first. And Huangdi is a word which now enters into the Chinese vocabulary in this meaning for the first time, and it means emperor. So Qin Shi Huangdi is the fellow that we identify as the first emperor of the Qin. And the adoption of the term Huangdi to mean emperor is a very significant act. Up until this time, the leader, the ruler, the head of a dynasty was called the king, and the term in Chinese is Wang. Huangdi was a very ancient mythological figure back there in the age of Yao and Shun that we talked about earlier, who was not necessarily even a fully human figure, a sort of spiritual being who guided certain of the affairs of mankind. For the king of Qin to, in 221, now adopt the title of Huangdi was a claim to a kind of rulership that had not been seen in China previously. It was a claim to total power over all of China. Now that the last of the other states had been eliminated, the entire territory of China was under a single rule. Qin Shi Huangdi proclaimed himself essentially to be the Lord of all. And it's a pretty grandiose claim. It's ironic, too, because as history plays out, the Qin dynasty only lasts 14 years. It lasts from 221 just down to 207 BCE. In that time, and in particular in the early years after unification, the Qin undertake dramatic transformations. They have established a single state controlling vast territory from the mountains in the north, on the north side of the plain in North China, all the way down into almost the tropics, almost into what is today Vietnam, out into the west a little bit, not quite down into the southwest too far. Sichuan is part of China at this point, but the highlands further southwest have not quite been brought in yet. But it's a very extensive territory, larger than the Zhou state had been in at its height, bringing in some areas that go beyond territories traditionally controlled by the Chinese. Qin Shi Huangdi continues to pursue expansive warfare on the frontiers. Within China, he sets about to create a single administrative system. And he pursues a number of policies, a number of campaigns, which are very significant because they create the conditions for an integrated empire to persist even after the Qin dynasty itself collapses. In the first place, this has to do with what we might call standardization. Standardization of many different phenomena. When China had been divided during these many, many centuries of division, the Spring and Autumn period, the Warring States period, when the Zhou order broke down and as many as 250 different states were scattered all over China. Local circumstances had diverged quite a bit. Early in the Zhou, with a single royal system, China had been fairly coherent. But during these long centuries of fragmentation, different parts of the country had sort of gone their own way in some very mundane and practical things. For example, wagons and carts had axles of different lengths. In one state, in the state of Lu that we've talked about, for example, your axle might be one length, and the wheels, when you run the carts down the road, of course, the wheels would carve ruts in the dirt roads. When you get to the border between the state of Lu and say, the state of Qi next door, the state of Qi might have carts with axles that were a different length, and so the ruts in the roads would be a different width. And so you'd have to, when you got to the border, take stuff out of one cart, put it in another cart, and go on your way. This was very effective for the warring states, for the different small states, because it meant that they could control trade across their borders. It was in fact desirable in some ways from the point of view of these many different rulers. When you're presiding over a unified empire and you want an integrated system of commerce all over your territory, it's a bad thing. So Qin Shi Huangdi decrees a proper length for axles, and of course it's the axle length of the state of Qin. So all carts, all wagons throughout China have to now have the same width of axles. And this makes, after a certain amount of time, for an integrated transportation and communication system. Coinage was another example. States had made their own coins, and they differed in shape. Some were shaped, there's some that they call spade-shaped, and some were made like little knife blades, and some places just used sort of lumps of copper. In the Qin state, the coins were round with a square hole in the middle so that they could be strung on string or rawhide. And the Qin coins were made the standard for the whole empire. Writing. The Chinese writing system. Individual states had sort of developed their own particular techniques for producing the written characters. The characters were essentially the same, but they were written a little bit differently, the style of the strokes composing the characters. Now, the characters of the state of Qin are prescribed as the national norm. So standardization to be imposed from the center as a way of bringing the whole system into consistency. But it was not simply a matter of material things, as carts, coins, writing. It was also important from the Qin point of view to establish a standardized ideological system. The Qin were not particularly enamored of the ideas of Confucius or Lao Tzu or Mozi or other people like that. For Qin Shi Huangdi, it was his ideas that counted. It was the doctrines of legalism that counted. And this led in the year 214 to one of the great traumatic events in Chinese history, which was the burning of books and the burying of scholars. Basically, any books that were not either teachings of legalism or practical texts, books about how to build agricultural equipment, or certain mathematical texts and things like that, books that were of purely practical utility or books that reflected the teachings of legalism were allowed. All other books were banished. And banished meaning if you owned a copy, you needed to turn it in. You needed to take it to your local government official and turn it in. And then they were all assembled and they were burned. Thousands and thousands of copies of books were burned. And of course, this is at a time when it's before the invention of printing in China. It's at a time when books were hand copied. And the destruction of these manuscripts was very, very thorough. The penalties were severe. If you were caught with a proscribed book, not only was the book burned, but so were you. So it was a system that meant to eradicate ideas other than those which were officially authorized by the Qin. Now, given that it was a time before printing, books, written texts, were only part of the way in which knowledge was transmitted. Perhaps even more significant was the oral teaching, the verbal teaching by scholars of their students. And so, to ensure that these doctrines were eradicated, Qin Shi Huangdi ordered that the scholars, the teachers, who knew these texts by heart, be rounded up, and they were buried alive. So, a very, very severe effort to eliminate non-orthodox ideas and teachings from the state, okay, from society. And it was very effective. We have very few texts which date from before the fall of the Qin dynasty. Most of the books that are older than this, which we have today, are versions that were written down after the fall of the Qin. There's a very, very active period once the Qin collapses and a new dynasty replaces it. There's a very, very intense period of trying to recover these texts. And of course, sometimes that results in alternate versions. One guy remembers it one way, another guy remembers it a different way. So there's alternate versions of texts sometimes emerged. This trauma was so severe that it led to a renewal. Ironically, I don't think this was what the Qin had in mind, but it led to a renewal of thinking about the problems of society and government in the next century, which we'll be talking about a bit later. Well, the Qin state, very powerful, very ruthless, very effective. The Qin system of legalism was a perfect mechanism for gaining power, but it proved not to be an effective mechanism for retaining power and for ruling, because although they imposed standardization, although they imposed ideological orthodoxy on the state, on the empire, there was no method of self-regulation. There was no moral restraint on the actions of the ruler. And Qin Shi Huangdi pursued his power totally in his own self-interest. Eventually, the cruelty, the extractions that he exacted from his people led them to revolt. And in 207, his state was overthrown. We'll look at the struggle to succeed him and the rise of the next dynasty, the Han, in the next lecture.